Hello, it's August 22nd, and it's about 8 o'clock in the evening. This is the gray night. So, my last recording, I was talking about things that annoyed me about the Republican Party, and since turnabout's fair play and all that, tonight we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about, some things that I find frustrating with the Democrat Party. I'm going to preface this by saying that, and I think I said this in my last reporting about the Republicans, but I just want to be clear in any event that, this isn't meant to be directed to everybody who's registered Republican or Democrat. It's more or less the national parties and some of the leadership there that these criticisms really apply to. I mean, obviously, if you are an adherent and any of these things apply to you, then fine. But I mean, it's not. I'm not attempting to lump everyone who has ever registered Democrat or Republican as having as adhering to these behaviors and beliefs. It's more or less just the central parties. Um, so uh, when I started with the Republicans, I kind of listed off a couple of major categories of things that annoyed me, and I'm kind of going to do the same thing here. With the Democrats, one of the things I'm seeing a lot of lately is this extreme skewing off to the left, which without touching over on a lot of substantive policy issues, because it's really not the point at this stage. Um, the party seems to be just kind of going further and further off into like the what you might think of as the hard left, either socialism or like left wing authoritarianism. Um, and along with that is there's an increasing intolerance for other viewpoints, and I think that's well, some of my I will say that some of my criticisms are directly related to that issue. I also see the Democrat Party increasingly becoming very, very. I think Tim Pool put it well when he said identitarian. And again, it's not all Democrats. There's a certain element of the Democrat Party that is doing this, and they're very much about this idea of, okay, your opinion is valued based on what your sex is, what your race is, are you gay or straight, are you cis or are you trans, that kind of thing. I think the term they use is intersectionality, but essentially that's, I think, to boil it down without using a lot of technical terms, it basically boils down to your opinion matters based on identity politics rather than on whether or not you can back it up with logic, whether or not it's an informed opinion, whether or not it's an opinion that makes sense. Um, another thing I'm seeing a lot of from the left wing of the Democrat Party these days is, and it's not as though the right isn't guilty of this as well, and the Republicans are certainly guilty of this at times as well, but disingenuous arguments. In other words, where they will say something they know to be either objectively false or at a minimum misleading in the way it's worded. Um, the gun control issue is a perfect example of that. And when I get into that a little more, I will say that I'm going to try not to get into arguing substantive what's good policy, what's bad policy. I really want to talk more about why, why I feel like the left in this country is really disingenuous when they talk about this issue. And again, it's not all of the left; it's some of the left. It's certain people who are very visible and vocal. Uh, the ad hominem has become a real problem from the left as well. And if you aren't familiar with that term, what that means is rather than attacking somebody's positions based on these are logical flaws with this position, you attack the person. It's things like crying racist anytime somebody expresses an opinion you don't like, or more generally saying bigot. Um, Another thing I see that really bothers me with the left, and I'm going to get into this in more detail in a little bit, is apologizing for and defending um, people who engage in objectively malicious and dangerous behavior. I mean, I'm thinking mainly of defenses of Antifa, but it's not strictly Antifa. Antifa is one group or a set of groups that are a problem, But you saw this also in defending lawless behavior by Black Lives Matter. And I'm probably going to get called racist for criticizing this, but I'm more than happy to take that on. I'm not racist as far as I feel. I have no animus against blacks. If there is legitimately a bad police shoot of anyone for any wrongful reason, absolutely that person should be prosecuted. My problem with Black Lives Matter is when you see violent and lawless behavior, and my problem with the Democrats defending them is that they defend lawless and violent behavior. Um, I'm also going to say that right now I see an awful lot of the Democrats have become a party of, and I'm going to quote Tim Pool again here. For those of you who have not listened to this, to Mr. Poole, from my perspective, he is a really, really well read, well researched, well thought out news commentator that pretty regularly posts to YouTube. And although I will say that on certain things I do disagree with him on certain specific substantive policy issues, I can respect I respect the hell out of anybody who can back up what they have to say with logic and reason and doesn't need to resort to personal attacks and emotionalism to make their point. Also, Mr. Poole is extremely well balanced in his discussion of what's going on in this country, and I respect the hell out of that. Mr. Poole, in this case, is what he refers to as like orange man bad, which is, in other words, hating anything and everything about Trump and about what Trump represents and what they think Trump represents, and then not offering anything in the way of substantive policy for what they policy alternatives to what Mr. Trump has offered. I'm not going to digress into becoming into Trump apologetics because that's not my point. More or less, my criticism boils down to: fine, you don't like the guy. If you're going to make assertions about the man's politics, or about the man's character, I should say, have something to back it up, but also offer an alternative. I mean, if you want me or anyone else to vote for you, you better have something better to offer than "we hate Trump." So those are the major things. I may touch on a few other things, but those are the major things I can think. Oh, and one last thing, and this was a criticism I had of Republicans as well, is hypocrisy. And we're going to definitely talk about that. And I think there's one other thing, and this sort of falls under hypocrisy, but there's this movement that I see right now on the left of what I would call social censorship. And I think that is something that is extremely dangerous and bears discussion. So I want to start, I kind of went down a long list there. I think we're going to start with discussing how the Democrat Party has just gone way off into left field. When President Barack Obama was president, he was, by a lot of us on the right, seen as pretty far to the left and kind of a socialist light type. I mean, his signature legislation, Obamacare, was a perfect example of that. Is putting a good chunk of the national economy under the direct control of the federal government, specifically Health and Human Services, and to a lesser extent the Treasury Department. Obamacare did allow for the existence of private insurance, and although it told the insurance companies what they were supposed to do, how they were supposed to do it, and who they, basically saying, well, you have to offer these services, you have to accept anybody who applies. And then the other major key piece of that legislation was compelling people to buy the insurance or to apply for Obamacare. And at the time that passed, that was considered pretty far left. Obama fairly broadly expanded food stamps. That was seen as pretty far left. What you did not see Obama doing, and I'm certainly no fan of his. I do think he was too far to the left. You didn't see him pushing things like the Green New Deal, they're basically wanting frank socialism and putting pretty much reorganizing the economy and putting the entire economy under um, under the federal government. I mean, that is frank socialism. And just so you guys know how I'm defining socialism, what I mean is when the government either directly owns and controls the means of production, particularly major industry, or where the government has regulated to such an extent that it's more or less a quasi public arm of the government. Things like utilities or like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, where it's technically private. It's so heavily regulated that essentially it's just another arm of the government. That's what I mean by socialism. I mean, there are socialist elements to Obamacare because it so heavily regulate, especially when President Obama was president. Um, Trump's rolled some of that back, although the full bore of Obamacare still does exist. Some of the more heavy-handed measures, like for example, the requirement to enroll no longer exist, but essentially, it is dictating to a private industry, the health insurance industry, how they have to do their business. So yes, it is socialistic. Um, I mean, when you look at Obama versus somebody, let's even use one of the more mainstream Democrat candidates, like Kamala Harris is a perfect example of this, who has basically said we should outright abolish the private market in health insurance and in health care and put it all under the federal government. That's a radical departure even from what Obama was pushing. Um, Obama wanted to do cap and trade. The Green New Deal basically was ban it, not tax it, ban it. And when I say ban it, I mean ban fossil fuels, ban coal, ban petroleum, ban natural gas. And also, by the way, let's ban nuclear while we're at it, even though that doesn't produce carbon emissions. That was to be banned under the Green New Deal as well. And for any of you guys who want to argue with me about this, I would invite you to read that. I have. I'm telling you, I'm not exaggerating when I say it was pretty much a fairly rapid ban. I mean, I think the time frame for this was something like 10, 15 years, in which the the stated policy goal is to ban fossil fuels, ban nuclear, ban it, not tax it. I mean, cap and trade was bad enough in the sense of, that was the objective, was to make it so expensive to use these resources that people would look for alternatives. But it didn't ever make it illegal. It didn't ever say you can't. It just said if you do, it's going to cost you money. Sort of like what we do with cigarettes and alcohol. Cigarettes and alcohol are expensive largely because of taxes, because they're heavily excise taxed. Then the goal is to discourage that behavior, as effective as that may be. That's what cap and trade was. Is basically it was a very expensive and heavy-handed tax scheme, but not a ban. What AOC and her crowd and the hard left Democrats are talking about now is ban it, outright ban it. In other words, like prohibition, where you use this now, you are now a criminal. That's what they're talking about doing. And that's far further to the left than anything Obama ever advocated. Um, and I don't know that he wouldn't have fallen in line with supporting that now. But at the time he was president, he was pushing far milder intervention. And again, I'm not an apologist for Obama. I'm just objectively pointing out the difference here. So this is how far the Democrats have gone. Some other examples of just how extreme they have gotten. Let's look at the Kavanaugh nomination. Here you have them motivated largely about concern over Roe versus Wade, the uh, Supreme Court ruling creating a federal right to abortion, that they were willing to essentially from a values point, if not from an actual let's change the law point, throw away the idea of innocent until proven guilty. I mean, this is supposedly a value we hold, a core value we hold, and they're basically we're going on record saying we believe Blasey Ford, we believe women, and the corollary with that, that is the implied statement that goes behind that is if you believe women, well, then you don't believe the man that the woman accused. In other words, he's guilty because accused. And that was the attitude towards Kavanaugh. And when they're really being honest, what Democrats said was basically, well, this isn't a court of law. This is a criminal court, so he's not entitled to that presumption. Yes, we absolutely are assuming he's guilty based on an accusation. And I will tell you, this is the problem I have with this, and I think this is probably a topic I will revisit later in more detail. But for right now, this is more of an overview of things that I find troubling about Democrats. The problem with that is we still use juries in criminal proceedings. Now, admittedly, if you know anything about how criminal proceedings usually work at the state and federal, and this would have been state charges, just so we're clear, not federal charges, at the state level, most cases never make it to jury trial. Most cases are either dismissed or plea bargained. That's probably a good thing, too, because if you've never seen a criminal docket, even in a small county, a not so populous county, a county without a lot of crime, they're busy as hell. They're always busy as hell. If every one of those cases went to jury trial, it would break the system. But nevertheless, here's my point. Juries are drawn from the general usually the way you get on jury lists is by registering to vote, but they're drawn from or by like giving your name to the government some way, like getting a driver's license, but they're drawn from the general population of that area. Now, what the Democrats did to try to defeat Kavanaugh is propagandize the nation, that is the general voting public and the general public at large, with this notion that women never lie about these things, that an accusation equals guilt. That was their position, and it was disingenuous, because I'm not terribly convinced they care about Blasey Ford, because if they really cared about her or any of the other women, but Blasey Ford's probably the one that would have been the most credible if any of them were credible at all, because her story was at least, it was at least quasi-logical. If you really believe that this is someone who is a victim of a sexual assault, you would think you would send them to the criminal authorities, that is law enforcement, to go file a report, because a senator has absolutely zero power, to directly speaking, to take any of these kind of matters up in criminal court, because they're the wrong branch of government. The only branch of government that has the power to go after someone who is an alleged rapist using criminal proceedings would be the executive. That would be your police and your prosecutors. So if your concern is that this person, quotes, gets justice, which was the mantra that was repeated endlessly by these Democrats, then why are you not encouraging this woman to go to law enforcement? Why are you allowing this situation? And I shouldn't even say allowing. Why are you deliberately politicizing something like that, that is, if you believe it to be true, an admittedly traumatic experience for this person? Why would you do that? Why would you not say, ma'am, if I take this up in the Senate, you understand you are going to become nationwide news. It will be politicized. The better solution is go to law enforcement, file a criminal complaint. Because that, if you go that path, you have a shot at justice. It's not guaranteed, but at least you have a chance. You go up in front of the Senate, you're going to have your name and reputation plastered all over everywhere and smeared. And the reality is, no matter how delicate the both parties are with the situation, and no matter how delicate the senators are with the situation, the reality is there's people on both sides of these kind of appointments that have a political agenda that will attempt to smear the players. In other words, there was an attempt to smear Kavanaugh, and there were attempts to smear Blasey Ford by third parties not affiliated with the senators involved in the hearings. Not that senators are exactly shining angels, because they were not. But ignoring them for a second, there are other players in this game that have huge stakes. I mean, the abortion industry is a multi-million-dollar industry. Their entire business model hinges on keeping Roe versus Wade the law of the land. You have a very active and committed movement on the other side of that to overturn that case. And there are other people as well who are active and committed to getting justices like Brett Kavanaugh on the court, because they are tired of activist judges. And many of these people have no qualms about attacking and smearing someone who decides to inject themselves into the argument for any reason. So I'm coming around to the point. I'm not convinced that these Democrats really care about Blasey Ford. Blasey Ford was a weapon, and that's all she was to them. She was a weapon to try to get at Kavanaugh. And the real concern for them was the abortion issue, largely because one of their major constituents and donors is the abortion industry. They cannot afford to get crosswise with these people. So yes, of course they're going to push that. But this is an example of extreme radicalism, to be that concerned about abortion that you were willing to throw due process out the window. And when you are deliberately propagandizing the public to with this believe women mantra, not believe, not, and to be clear about this, from my perspective, I don't think you should believe women. I don't think you should believe men. I think you should believe evidence and facts. And when I say you shouldn't believe women, I don't mean to say that women who make accusations of rape are liars. That's not what I mean. I do think they should be any criminal accusation, whether it's somebody shoplifted a candy bar from Walmart or this person assaulted me in the street, should be taken seriously, and it absolutely should be investigated. And if evidence comes to light that a crime was indeed committed by a certain person, then by all means prosecute that person, and prosecute them aggressively within the confines of the law. However, when you start propagandizing the public with this idea that believe women, what you're really telling them is accused equals guilty. And that is dangerous, because these are the same people that are going on juries. That's the same pool of people. And how is an accused to get a fair hearing if that's going to be what you're telling your prospective jurors? That's a huge problem, and it is a form of radicalism. Um, I mentioned about that. I did want to talk as well about this defense of extremist groups, defense of Antifa, defense of Black Lives Matter. Where my problem is with this, um, I think I firmly believe everybody's entitled to their opinion, no matter how wacky it is. That's fine. You're certainly entitled to your opinion. I believe everyone's entitled to voice their opinion, no matter how, no matter whatever their opinion is, and whether it's well informed or not well informed, whether they have anything useful to say or not. I really believe that that's free speech, that's your right. Where I draw the line is when you're talking about lawless behavior and especially violent behavior. And just so I'm clear, this is what I mean by lawless behavior. Um, when you have people committing acts of vandalism, when you have people that are doing things like um, marching across the interstate and blocking traffic and then threatening motorists, when you have people defecating on private property and leaving a mess, um, that's what I'm talking about. And I have a huge problem with this. I really do. Um, you can certainly stand in solidarity with peaceful, law-abiding protesters. You want to march, march. You want to hold up signs, hold up signs. You want to chant and shout slogans. I got no problem with that. I may disagree with you reasons, but that's fine. That is absolutely your prerogative. It is your right. And to be blunt about it, I'd fight and die for that right of anybody, no matter how much I disagree with them, no matter how idiotic their opinion may be to me. That is absolutely your right. But that doesn't mean you get to show up and break the law. It doesn't mean you get to show up and throw rocks and bottles, beat people up, um, make threats of violence, destroy property, block traffic, and make it so people can't get to their homes or get to their place of business. That kind of behavior is not okay. Showing up to a speaker you don't like and pulling the fire alarm because you want to shut them down is not okay. And it troubles me greatly that this is the behavior that the Democrats have now come out and gone on record. And it's not hard to find this. Democrats have gone on record defending Black Lives Matter, defending Antifa, defending illegal acts by Occupy Wall Street, which, by the way, I'm no fan of theirs either, but compared to some of these groups now, they were downright tame. I think the worst thing they were guilty of is trespassing and squatting, which I still see that as lawless behavior, but they were not, for the most part, engaged in active violence. There were some incidents of it, yes, but it was not to the scale of what you see coming out of Antifa, where I mean, the Andy No incident is the one that's been, that's one of the more recent ones, and it's an especially egregious example, but it's not unique. You have this guy who decided to try to firebomb an ICE detention center, which I don't really know what he thought he was going to accomplish with that, but I guess that's beside the point. When you have the Democrats and the leftist media coming out and trying to apologize for and defend this, or the other thing they will say all the time is they don't want to call them rioters, they don't want to call them terrorists. They want to use the word protesters. And my problem with that is protesters basically is soft pedaling what these people are do. Protesting to me is you show up and picket. You show up and march. If you're going to say cross into gray areas, maybe, a sit-in or chaining yourself to a door, which that could potentially be lawless behavior. But to be quite frank about it, I have far less of a problem with that than let's block the interstate and threaten motorists, or let's throw bottles and rocks and smash business windows. Um, I have a huge problem with any Democrat that's going to defend or apologize for that. It is not okay. Especially since Antifa in particular is engaged in a form of social censorship. One of their major activities is to shut up people with opinions they don't like. They'll label you, if you voice an opinion that is contradictory to their dogma, they will label you a fascist, and they will behave violently towards you. They will attack you physically. They will threaten you. They will try to get you get you to lose your job, and they will potentially destroy your property. I don't care whether you agree with me or not. That's certainly your prerogative to disagree with me. I don't necessarily think it's fair to label everyone who disagrees with you a fascist, but okay, fine. If that's really how you want to operate, I want to talk about that behavior in a moment. But uh, it's not okay to attempt to harm the person for having an opinion you do not like. And it's not okay to sit back, as some folks have done, and say, well, that's not First Amendment protected because they're not government actors. That's true. That is true. And I'm not necessarily saying that this should be an issue related to First Amendment law, because I agree, the First Amendment is meant to apply to government. However, I don't believe that we as a people, we as a nation, should tolerate this kind of behavior on any level, because having a First Amendment is great, but if you are facing private vigilante groups, and I think that's a fair criticism of Antifa, certainly, private vigilante groups that are going to come looking for you, intending to do you physical harm for having an opinion they don't like, and having the chutzpah to speak that opinion, then if we as a public are going to look the other way for that, we don't have free speech. No, you won't be prosecuted in the courts. You'll be prosecuted in the streets. Moving along, I want to talk also about this ad hominem crap, and this is nothing new, and both sides are guilty of it. It's just right now it's worse on the Democrat side. There's a pattern of um, if you come up with a valid, factually based, logical position that contradicts something that some of the Democrats and some elements of the left have pushed, there is a tendency, and it's been going on for a long time, for them to attack you as a bigot or a racist. Are the most obvious examples. The viewpoint, and there's a really good video by Tim Pool, and you should look it up on here. Is that he was talking about how the left wing view tends to be that, and it's not everyone on the left. I want to be fair about this. But there's enough of them to constitute a critical mass. Will view you as evil for having a contrary view. Not that you have an opinion they disagree with, but that you are morally suspect for having that viewpoint, and that has metastasized into you are morally suspect for voting Republican or voting for Trump. I can tell you personally, I've encountered this. I not long after Trump's election was personally attacked by people I would have counted as friends based on opinions I had expressed and based on some things I posted, and also based on how I was presumed to have voted. Um, And when I say personally attacked, I mean, to be blunt, accused of racism and bigotry for some opinions I had, and my opinions in question were some things I said about some of these some folks' reactions after Trump was elected, and I was specifically criticizing folks who took to the streets and started lighting bonfires and throwing bottles and rocks and acting and vandalizing property and being violent. And I called it what I called it as I saw it. I said I called that a riot, and I reposted some articles covering that, and someone who shall remain nameless, who I would have once called a friend, had came back and attacked me personally as a racist, and as an alt right racist, I believe, if I recall correctly, was how she put it, for having posted this and expressed this opinion. And I've seen people who I consider friends post things like, if you voted for Trump, you defriend me and don't ever speak to me again. You're as much a racist as he is. These are the types of things I'm talking about when these folks, some of these folks are so extreme that they view anyone who disagrees with them as being morally suspect. Anyone who supported Trump for any reason is being morally suspect. And I can tell you from my own personal, and these are anecdotal, you know, I don't claim to know why the majority of the people who voted for Trump voted for Trump. There are people who are truly believe in him and really thought he was a good candidate. But there's also folks that are like myself and some people I know where their reason for voting for Trump wasn't because they wanted to vote for Trump. It was because of who his opponent was. And I think this is a topic for another day, but suffice it to say, Hillary Clinton had serious character issues of her own. And there were folks who really would not support her. I know for my part, my view is she was blatantly and outspokenly lawless. And I will not support anybody, for president who has that type of that type of a viewpoint, that type of a behavior. I don't care about political affiliation. I won't support that, especially not with not for anyone for government, but particularly not the chief law enforcement officer in the nation. Um, but in any case, you see this a lot where folks on the left, when you come up with a good, factual, logical argument that is well reasoned, will come back and say, well, you're a racist for having that viewpoint, or you're a racist for thinking that way. Um, you see this a lot. Uh, and I personally take it as an admission that I'm right. And I've even told people that, where that's the response I get is, well, gee, and I'll respond with, thank you for acknowledging I'm right. But it's problematic because the bottom line is these people on the left who do this, one, that kind of behavior evidences the fact, to me at least, that they don't have anything intelligent to say, and many times they don't know what they're talking about. They're what I like to think of as reflexive lefties. In other words, they really don't pay a lot of attention to the niggling details of what it is that they say they believe in, and they just adopt left-leaning positions because it sounds like a good idea. Now, there are people on the right that are the same way, and I have the exact same opinion of them, which is to say that I don't like them. And I don't like that because you are allowing yourself to be led, to be told what to think by somebody else. If you're going to take a position, particularly if you're going to strongly adopt that position, you really ought to know what you're talking about. Otherwise, it gets dangerous because you can easily be talked into believing in something that sounds like a good idea on paper until you put it into practice. And I think history bears it out that that's dangerous. Um, Communism sounds like a good idea on paper. The idea of making everybody equal, eliminating social class, social distinction. Um, Communism has led to more deaths than fascism. It's not as well publicized, and I take nothing away from what the Nazis did, but the most prolific killer leader in history was not a fascist. He was not a Nazi. It was Mao Zedong. Check the numbers. Don't take my word for it. Um, Millions, maybe billions, but definitely millions died in China under his rule because of policies he pushed and because of executions. Stalin killed millions of his own people, either by execution or by sending them to gulags, because he considered them political enemies. Fascism certainly is a dangerous political philosophy, led to a lot of deaths. It's it is rightly condemned to the dustbin of history. Communism is just as bad, and there's still people that espouse it. And it is an example of one of those things that it sounds like a great idea on paper, and if you don't look at it critically and don't think carefully, you can easily be deceived into towing the party line and agreeing to things that are dangerous. So I don't like reflexivism, and that is one thing that I think ad hominems uh, are evidence of. I think another problem with ad hominems is that it shuts down the conversation and people stop listening. If you want to be persuasive and convince someone to agree with you, attacking them personally is the worst way to go about doing that. The goal of attacking somebody personally isn't to get them to agree with you. It's to get them to shut up. It's to shut down discussion. That is the only thing that accomplishes. You're not really winning the argument. You're winning silence at best. And at the point of a gun, the person may shut up and go along to preserve themselves. I think when the threat is more or less, I'm going to try to destroy your reputation, the person might shut their mouth and quietly go along, or they may be pushed underground. But at the end of the day, you're not persuading anybody. Um, and it is a destructive approach. It's not particularly useful or helpful. If you have a good idea, you shouldn't need to resort to the ad hominem. You should be able to defend it and explain why it's a good idea. Going further down this path, too, I think this is a good segue into the identitarianism on the left. If I were to boil down a lot of what's coming out of the Democratic left in this country these days, and again, it's not everybody, but it's enough people that it really troubles me. I hear an awful lot of, if you're white, you're racist. If you're male, you're sexist and racist. If you are white male, you're basically Satan from their viewpoint. You don't get to have opinions on certain subjects. Like, there are feminists on the left that will flat out say if you're a man, you don't get to have an opinion on abortion. And if the shoe was on the other foot, if people in the 2A crowd, Second Amendment crowd, started saying, well, if you don't own a gun, you don't get to have an opinion on that, how long is that going to last? If a man told a woman, well, you don't have a prostate gland, so you don't get to have an opinion on funding for prostate cancer, how long do you think that's going to last? They'd take offense. Why is it that they think that that's okay? I mean, I'd like to hear somebody explain that. And this stupid argument about keep your laws off my body, that is so illogical. I don't even know. I mean, I guess my response to that is okay. I The law tells you what you can do with your body all the time. Every state in the union has laws governing things like assault and battery, rape, sexual assault, homicide. I mean, you can't use your. There's all kinds of laws that tell you what you can and can't do with your body. And on a more fundamental level, because if they want to say, well, assault and battery, rape, sexual assault, murder, they all involve using your body to invade someone else's bodily autonomy. That's true. You also can't walk into a physician's office and say, gee, Dr. So and so, today I'd like you to chop off my right hand. You try that, you probably aren't going to get charged with a crime, but I'm willing to bet you're going to find yourself in a hospital somewhere. You may find yourself in a padded room, and you may find yourself with a one-way overcoat if you take my meaning. The doctor's not going to chop your hand off for you. They're not. So to sit there and say that you don't get to legislate what someone can does with their body is just nonsense. To sit there and say that a man can't have an opinion about this because it somehow doesn't impact the man is also nonsense. Because there are legal consequences to siring a child as a man. And seeing as right now as the law stands, you don't get a say in whether or not the woman has an abortion. She, if she's pregnant, has your destiny in her hands. Literally. And again, this is a topic for another discussion. I'm not going to go too far down that road other than to say this is the kind of absurd identitarian nonsense that you hear out of the left. And I think from my perspective, you spend 2 years, 3 years hearing nothing but the Democrats talking trash about you as a white male, and then they have the nerve to turn around and they want my vote and other white males' votes. And from my perspective, it's like, if you're going to tell me for the last 3 years I'm a racist, I'm a bigot, I'm intolerant, I'm privileged, that's another one that's connected to this that I'm going to touch on in a second. Don't ask me for my vote. I don't necessarily agree with everything the Republican Party does, and I don't think they give two sniffs about the average Joe Blow. But at least they're not trashing me the way you guys are. Um, if I'm going to vote, I'm more inclined to vote for the person that didn't spend the past, or for the party that didn't spend the past 3 years telling me that I'm a piece of crap for how I was born, and then turning around and having the nerve to say that you're the party of civil rights. Really? You're the party of civil rights. You're the party that wants to push affirmative consent laws and, well, let me be fair about it. You're the party that wants to push Title IX policies that basically, if I'm in school and I get accused of sexual misconduct, I think is the term that most colleges are using these days, you're the party that supports the idea that I should be guilty until I should be guilty because I'm accused. You're the party that, behind the Me Too movement has been basically saying that you've been propagandizing the public to think that accused equals guilty, or trying to propagandize the public that way. You're the party that has basically, when men express concern about that, you come up with a song this is another one, and it's probably going to have to be a topic for another video in the future. But a song mocking men, and you guys know which song I'm talking about. I think its title is "Scary Time to Be a Man." Mocking men for being concerned about a false accusation. I mean, do you folks, and some of these people mocking men are men. Have you not stopped and considered, what if it was you? What if it was your son? I'm not suggesting that women are all liars when they come out and say these things. What I am suggesting is that mistakes do happen. And when I say mistakes, I mean um, either mistaken identity, or somebody has a sexual encounter that they end up regretting later, and somebody talks them into thinking it's rape because they feel regret. And yes, that does happen. Um, I know of a story in particular of someone who took a girl home from a party, and one thing led to another, and they had sex. Well, they'd both been drinking, and she apparently had her wits together enough to think to put a diaphragm in. She's walking home to her dorm the next day, leaving his room, and with looking like she'd been out all night doing exactly what she had been doing, and bumps into mom and dad. And of course, dad confronts her and gives her the usual "what the hell" speech. And of course, she says she was raped. And she says she was raped because she's not going to sit there and say, "Well, gee, Dad, I got drunk at a party and went home with a guy I barely know and slept with him." She got backed into it, and one thing leads to another, and now this kid is going to prison because he took a girl home from a party and they had a couple drinks. And she had her shit, excuse me, she had her wits about her enough to think to put in a diaphragm. This was not a forcible situation. And yes, the fact that she put the diaphragm in doesn't necessarily imply that she couldn't have said no later. But that, as the story was told to me, that's not what happened. She never told him no. Her story was she had been drinking and didn't know what she was doing. And because that jurisdiction has a rule that if you have had even one drink as a female, you are now legally incapacitated from consenting, he's screwed. He's going to prison. These are the kind of policies that go along with this Me Too nonsense, and this is the kind of thing that when it's just, blindly believe accused equals guilty, and yeah, innocence can get jammed up. Also, it creates a situation where if you are facing an accusation, you have a powerful incentive to never go to trial, but to plea bargain. Because if the DA comes along and says, "Well, gee, that's a real bad mess you're in. How about I offer you probation if you plead guilty?" Whereas the crime in question typically will carry a lengthy prison sentence. Are you going to get, plenty of guys would look at that and say, "Do I really want to gamble with my freedom in front of a jury that is inevitably going to be hostile to me from the moment I walk through the door, because because my name has the word rapist near it in a criminal information or an indictment, and a certain group of activists and a certain political party have been out pushing this notion that accused equals guilty." The guy may be innocent and take the plea anyway because he doesn't want to risk going to prison. I don't know that this is the majority of cases. I suspect it is not. My experience with criminal court at large is that a lot of folks are in criminal court because they should be in criminal court, because they broke the law in one way or another. But there are people that are genuinely innocent that get jammed up anyway. There are examples of people who go to prison for sex crimes who shouldn't. There have been people who have been exonerated based on DNA evidence. And also, this is another thing to keep in mind. Inaccurate doesn't always mean lying, it means inaccurate. If you ever have done any courtroom litigation, whether you've been a litigant, an attorney, or a witness, witnesses are some of the worst evidence you can take to court. People see what they want to see, they remember things how they want to remember them, and they always, 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 even when they don't mean to, have some personal agenda, because people have agency. That is, they have free will, they have their own mind, they have their own attitudes and beliefs about the world around them. For this reason, witness testimony is not as reliable as everybody thinks it is. Eyewitnesses are not nearly as accurate as forensics. And the same goes for especially victims, and especially victims of violent crime. Because let's be honest, if the person is a genuine victim of a violent crime, or even if they really honestly believe they're a victim of a violent crime, they will be traumatized. So their memory is probably suspect, even if they really are trying to be truthful. And that is a problem too. And that's why accused should never equal guilty. And I do really, really fault the Democrats for getting in bed with this nonsense through the Kavanaugh hearings. This is an extremely dangerous thing. And I'm kind of going back on that and didn't mean to. But the identitarianism is a problem. This idea that recently the Democratic leadership purged a whole bunch of people from the congressional committee because they were the wrong gender or the wrong race or both. You got activists going around saying things like abolish white men, or ban whiteness. And then there's this whole discussion about privilege. And I think I'm going to wrap it up on this, with this area of the discussion anyway. I don't believe in white privilege. I think privilege exists in this country, but I really think it goes along socioeconomic lines. But even if you believe it does exist, here's my problem with going around talking about this. You have folks on the left teaching this to young kids. The implied message of this discussion boils down to, if you aren't part of the privileged group, you are inherently at a disadvantage, so why try? It's not your fault if you're failing, it's Whitey's fault, to put it crudely. So it really just encourages young people to be angry, bitter, and resentful, and to not try. Because why should they? The game's rigged against them. You always have a better chance of getting ahead by working hard than by not. You can still fail, you can still be defeated, and that's an unfortunate fact of life. Just because you work your butt off doesn't mean it's always going to go your way. But you certainly have a better chance by that than by than by not even trying. It's just, to me, that's just really unhelpful. Playing the game that, and here's another example. You had people who, when Hillary Clinton was running for president, basically arguing that she was entitled to be president just because she's a woman and she was running. And that it was sexist that she had to face any opponent. And I've seen this argument, and people try to argue this with a straight face. Why is she entitled to it? Why does her gender matter? I mean, either she's qualified or she's not, but it's ultimately up to the electorate to decide that. We're not a monarchy. People aren't just entitled to anything. You want to be president, go convince the voters and earn it. And I'm female, or for that matter, this started with Obama with vote for me because I'm black. But now with Hillary, it was vote for me because I'm female, and I'm not gonna vote for someone just because they're black, white, in yellow, green, male, female. I don't care. I'm gonna vote for the person I'm convinced is the most qualified, and whose positions on the substantive issues are most aligned with mine. Um, and I don't think sitting there and saying it's sexist to be opposed to a female candidate, because, well, she's female. So, that's not a qualification. It really should have nothing to do with anything. Doesn't matter. At least not to me, and it shouldn't matter. And who are you to call me or anyone else sexist because they don't want to vote for a female candidate if they believe the other candidate, who happens to be male, is more qualified? Now, if you have objective evidence that the only reason they believe the male candidate is more qualified is because he's male, well, then maybe you have an argument. But to say vote for any candidate, well, they're female, I don't care. I don't care. Um, so moving along, so hypocrisy. Let's talk about that a little bit. And I definitely ragged on the Republicans for this. There was a time when the liberal, and these folks probably could actually be honestly called liberals, not leftists. Liberal Democrats champion free speech, even the most extreme examples. They would go so far as to defend things like piss Christ. And I mean, if you really want to know what that is, go ahead and Google it. And you know what? I'll come right out and say they were right to defend it. The ACLU was right when it defended the neo-Nazis who wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois. And I don't like the neo-Nazis. Nazis are, as far as I'm concerned, are scum. I don't support racism. I sure as hell don't support fascism. I do not support anti-Semitism. But as far as do they have the right to march and express their viewpoint, however heinous as it may be, yes. And that in that particular circumstance, the ACLU was absolutely right to defend them. Now you have the left going around crowing about shutting down Trump rallies and shutting down the Proud Boys because, they're racist and Trump's racist and we have to shut them down because we can't tolerate this speech. Or shutting down speakers like Milo Yiannopoulos. I'm not one of his fans. I'm not. I don't really like Ann Coulter, to be honest. I may have right-leaning views. I don't like provocateur types. I don't like people that are in your face obnoxious. I don't care what their politics are. Ben Shapiro's all right, although he can be kind of a D-bag sometimes. At least he's logical, and he's not as just blatantly obnoxious and offensive as Ann Coulter. I like him okay when he's not being kind of a D-bag. I don't like the nastiness on the right any more than I like the nastiness on the left. But when you have the Democrats and these other lefties saying we have to shut them down, or supporting somebody, supporting folks that say, and you know who I'm talking about, I'm trying to avoid naming names here, some people who say that Trump supporters need to be destroyed. I'd say this is hypocrisy because you guys talk about how you are supposedly champions of free speech and champions of quote-unquote diversity. But you don't champion diversity of thought. You don't anymore defend the right of somebody with an opinion you don't like to speak. Instead, you support people like groups like Antifa that show up to beat the shit out of them. And excuse my language, I am so sorry about that. To beat up people who have a viewpoint they don't like. Um, you talk about the right being intolerant and racist, and then you sit there and trash and do nothing but denigrate white people and males and Christians. For all of the talk about uh, bigotry against Muslims, and it's out there. I'm not going to say it's not, it isn't, because it is. You guys have no qualms whatsoever about calling all Christians and homophobic bigots, racist, sexist. You attack Christian dogma. You attack people for being you attack Christians for trying to push their values on non-Christians, while you simultaneously try to compel Christian organizations and individual Christians to violate tenets of their faith. Um, and you can argue all day long that, well, that's the right thing to do. Beside the point. The bottom line is, if you are going to say, don't push your values on me, then you better darn well live by that same philosophy and don't do it to somebody else. Forcing a Catholic organization to pay for somebody's abortion, you guys should well know where the Catholic uh, Church stands on that. Um, I mean, it's high hypocrisy to do that. And I'll call it out on the right when I see it, but I'm going to call it out on the left as well. I mean, that's just straight out wrong. Um, I want to talk a little bit about social censorship. Um, this is, and it's probably going to end up becoming a longer video on its own, but it's just kind of a general blush on this. This has become a new tactic of the Democratic left in particular, where they will threaten violence. They will try to find out who your employer is and threaten your employer with boycotts and other tactics to get you fired. They will um, dox you and reveal your public information to other people, or reveal your private information to other people. I mean, Julian Castro is a perfect example of this. Trying to shame people for supporting Trump. And the point, that's how he presents it. The point of that is to attract the little minion activists to show up at these folks' homes, show up at these folks' kids' schools, show up at their place of employment, and cause trouble. Try to cause that person harm. Um, that kind of behavior is what I mean when I say social censorship. Trying to get people, harassing people if they're trying to have dinner out with their family. Um, beating the tar out of a guy because he had a MAGA hat on. This is social censorship. The goal of this behavior is to make people comply or be silent. Either speak what we want you to speak or don't speak. That's what that is. The same thing when these student groups threaten to riot because a speaker with an opinion they don't like is going to speak on their campus. Or they resort to disruptive tactics like pulling the fire alarm or throwing objects. Showing up and trying to shout them down. That's social censorship. Trying to get somebody kicked out of school under hate speech codes. That's social censorship. And how you don't have free speech if you have an environment where that sort of thing is going on. I don't know that the law is an appropriate way to address this. I think we need to address it culturally. Part of having an open and free society is culturally being willing to allow people to speak even if they have an opinion you don't like, and not attacking them for it. It's not just don't prosecute them. It's, don't you don't try to destroy that person or harm that person because they have an opinion you dislike. In the case of violence or vandalism, that should be prosecuted. In the case of trying to reputationally destroy the person, that's probably something for the courts as well. You may have a cause of action there for, defamation, maybe. Some of this stuff, I think it just needs to become one of those things that we just don't tolerate. And when I say we don't tolerate it, I mean shaming the people who do this. And having the class not to do it to begin with. Teach your kids better, guys, parents. When you're bringing your children up, you know, you ought to have that conversation about common decency. You don't have to like what the person has to say, but that doesn't mean you get to harass them or their family. Um, there are other ways to respond to that are more mature, that are more respectful, and don't involve trying to personally wreck the person because you don't like their opinion. I think we can have political discourse in this country and not resort to scorched earth tactics. Um, and I think that's what I want to say about that for now. It's a topic for another day. Uh, so the Democrats. Um, I guess another thing I probably want to talk about, because I'd be remiss not to talk about it, and I'm not going to say that the right is never guilty of this, but I see the left becoming more about this as the ends justifying the means. Um, they'll support things like judicial overreach. They'll support things like executive overreach if the substantive policy outcome is what they want. There's a case making its way through the courts right now under Title IX and under federal law. And for those of you who don't know, what Title IX is it deals with sex discrimination. Sex discrimination being somebody is discriminated against because they're male, or they're discriminated against because they're female. Now, there is a long line of cases interpreting these laws. It's always been interpreted as discrimination based on someone being male or female. Well, this case basically is dealing with the problem. It's dealing with a situation where an individual was discharged after announcing to their employer that they were going to transition as a transgender. I'm going to come right out and say I think that's a crappy thing to do to a person. If their transitioning isn't going to impact their ability to do their job, then, and I believe this person was an exterminator or something like that, but assuming that it doesn't, and if I'm wrong, feel free to correct me, but the overall point, and I'm sure I'm going to get nitpicked and attacked, well, you don't know what you're talking about. The overall point I'm trying to get around to is this. This person is now suing his employer under Title IX for sex discrimination. I don't like what the employer did. I'm going to come right out and say it. That being said, I know enough about Title IX law, and I'm not an expert, but I read enough about it that I have a general gist. I don't think it was, based on my read at least, of the law, that it was not meant to address transgender status. So what this lawsuit is really doing is inviting the federal courts to expand the definition. In other words, they're asking the courts to be activist. And the Trump administration has come out in opposition to this. And of course, the headlines all read that, and I saw a Time magazine headline about this recently saying that Trump is asking the courts for permission to discriminate. Well, all right. Number one, Trump isn't the one doing the lawsuit. It's it's the Department of Justice. Which yes, I understand it's under his authority. Yada 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 yada. I'm sure he's not directing traffic day to day on this. I think he has other things to worry about. Also, it's a misstatement for another reason. The way I read their own article, I mean, I'm going off of Time Magazine's article. I haven't dug into the facts of this case. I may do so at a future date. Time Magazine's own article basically says that the DOJ is arguing essentially that the law is not interpreted that way. It hasn't ever been historically interpreted that way, and this would be an exercise in judicial activism. It should not be interpreted that way because it hasn't been in the past. I don't see that as asking for permission to discriminate. Um, I don't. I think it's asking the court, look, please don't legislate from the bench, guys. Okay, please, really. Um, and I think it's a misstatement too, because if you're saying they're asking the court's permission to discriminate, that implies that the law covers transgender status as it stands. I don't think that's accurate. I don't, based on my understanding of the case law. And again, not my area of expertise, but as a person who has read case law and statutes and has some understanding of it, I would say I don't think it is meant to be interpreted that way. I don't think that's what the legislators intended when they wrote the law. Um, and the case law would back me up on that point. I don't think that's what the law means. And if the court decides to let this lawsuit go forward under Title IX, then it is judicial activism, and that's how I see it. Um, and the problem I see with that is it's an exercise in judicial activism. This is an example of something that should people be allowed to discriminate against transgendered individuals? I don't think so. No, unless there's some other, unless you have some articulable reason why in this specific circumstance, I should be allowed. If it's a religious organization where it directly violates, canon law or something like that, that's a little bit of a different situation. I think as a general rule, no. It's probably something that ought to be the subject of some kind of anti-discrimination law, but it needs to be handled by the legislature and not the courts. Um, Moving along, because I got a little bit off on that, but moving along, I also want to talk a little about some of the disingenuous. That's an example of disingenuous statements being made. Some of the other disingenuous crap that gets brought out is, um, well, the gun control arguments are a perfect example. The Democrats insist on talking about assault weapons. What is an assault weapon? This is a made-up term. If you have anybody with a background with firearms who's read anything about firearms, nowhere in any book talking about firearms from a technical standpoint are you ever going to find the term assault weapon. You won't. Because there is no such thing. There is a particular type of firearm called an assault rifle. An assault rifle refers to a select fire rifle that takes an intermediate cartridge. What is a select fire rifle? This is a rifle that can fire on semi-automatic and either fully automatic or burst fire, sometimes both. But it has the ability where you pull the trigger, it'll shoot more than one bullet per trigger pull. That is an assault rifle. Base is actually was originally, given with a brief diversion into history, it was originally an invention of the Germans during World War II. And the original name for it was Sturmgewehr, in German. It was an assault rifle. Sturmgewehr could fire on full automatic. Could also fire on semi-automatic. That's an assault rifle. The only reason I can see for referring to rifle mass market firearms as assault weapons is that what it looks to me, and there's some evidence I think to back this up, is you will hear Democrats and gun control activists talking about automatic weapons as if you're talking about a fully automatic weapon. And I want to explain to you guys, for those of you who don't know the difference, this is the difference. A fully automatic firearm will continue to shoot as long as the trigger is depressed until it runs out of bullets, and with no further action by the shooter. That is a fully automatic weapon. A semi-automatic weapon is a weapon where once it's charged, that is, once you have cycled the bolt one time, you pull the charging lever back or the bolt back, however you want to describe that, and let it snap forward. Or in the case of a pistol, you would pull back the slide and let it snap forward. There's a round chambered when you do that. In other words, there's a round moved into position to fire. Then you pull the trigger, it'll fire that weapon and cycle the bolt or the slide, and it will automatically load another round into position to be fired. That's a semi-automatic weapon. Now, if you continue to hold the trigger, it's not going to fire another round unless you release the trigger and pull it again. That is it's a different type of firearm from a fully automatic weapon. However, there are gun control activists that will deliberately try to conflate the two by just using the term automatic. Automatic really refers to a machine gun in a lot of people's minds, and I think in a technical sense it also refers to a machine gun. That is a fully automatic weapon. You pull the trigger, it'll fire until it runs out of bullets, and all you have to do is hold the trigger. Now, for those of you not familiar with the current status of federal law in regards to fully automatic weapons, they're what's called a Class 3 firearm. Now, Class 3 firearms are covered by the National Firearms Act. Now, machine guns in particular are basically, you can't buy a new machine gun in this country unless you have a Class 3 dealer's license, which they're expensive, to put it mildly, and it's a fee every year and a pain in the butt. Not something your average gun owner has. The only other way to get a fully automatic weapon is if you buy one that's grandfathered in. That is, it's been manufactured before about 1983. And in that case, you are permitted to own that firearm. Otherwise, they're basically not available to the public. As a result of this, anything that's grandfathered in, they're valuable as hell because there aren't very many of them. So you're talking about somewhere north of $15,000-$20,000 for one of these items, or more depending on what it is. And then don't take my word for it. You want to know, if you want to see what I'm talking about, go on Gunbroker and look for a fully look for a fully automatic M16, like a fully automatic what's another good example? Like a Thompson, Mac 10, any of those kind of firearms that fire on full auto, and go look for the price yourself. I will tell you right now, they are exorbitantly expensive, and they're not always available. This is not the type of firearm that is in normal circulation. What you see in normal circulation and what they are trying to ban is the AR-15 and other weapons that look like that. The AR-15 is not a machine gun. It does not fire on full auto. It's not an M16. It looks like an M16. Mechanically, though, it's different. This is a gun that you pull the trigger once and it fires one bullet. Now, without getting into a lot of substantive argument, because I'm not here to argue gun control from a substantive standpoint, my point in bringing it up is to discuss the disingenuous discussion. You can't talk to people on the left about these weapons because they don't want to discuss it honestly. They want to conflate an AR-15 that fires on semi-auto with an M16 that is issued in the military that can fire on full auto or 3-round burst. And they deliberately want to do this because machine guns are scary. And people think of when people think of these of a machine when they think of an M16, they think of the A team where someone's spraying bullets everywhere, and that's what they think an AR-15 does. That's intentional. That's exactly what these activists want people to think. Another example of disingenuous is they talk about about reasonable gun control. But what happens is reasonable well, first of all, reasonable is all in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? What may be reasonable to one person may not be to another. But then the other thing is they start saying, well, we don't really want gun confiscation, but they do. Hillary Clinton campaigned on reasonable gun control, but then when she was talking to her own activist base, when she was asked what was a model of gun control that she agreed with and thought what should be implemented here, she cited Australia. Australia has had widespread bans on whole categories of weapons and mandatory buybacks. And mandatory buyback is a nice way of saying confiscation under rules that force that are similar to the takings clause in the federal constitution. What's the takings clause, you ask? Well, basically what it is if the government appropriates your property for public purposes, which it has the authority to do, that's eminent domain, it has to pay for it. It can't just take it. It has to pay for it. That's essentially what is being done with these compulsory gun buybacks. Essentially what they're saying is either we get to buy your gun or we're going to make you a criminal if you don't let us buy your gun. So to say reasonable gun control is somewhat disingenuous. You're not trying to regulate, you're trying to ban. And I would have more respect if you would come out and say we think we want to ban it. But they don't. They want to lie and obfuscate. You cannot debate with these people for that exact reason. And then, of course, the other thing they'll go around doing is telling people things like, well, AR-15s are uniquely deadly. Well, I would invite anyone who says that to go out and actually shoot an AR-15, because most of the ones that say this have never shot a gun in their lives. Shoot an AR-15 and then get a hold of a deer rifle, just a plain Jane 30-06 bolt-action deer rifle, and shoot that. I will represent to you, but go test this one yourself. That 30-06 bolt-action deer rifle, shot for shot, is far more powerful than a standard AR-15. And I'll quickly explain what I mean, and then I'm going to move along. Um, the AR-15 shoots in its standard caliber is 5.56 NATO rounds or a 223, depending on exactly which one it is. It's the same size bullet. They have a different powder load is the distinction. And essentially, a 5.56 or a 223 round, whichever you're talking about, it's a 22 caliber bullet. It's an elongated 22 caliber bullet with a heavy powder charge behind it. Now, is it a deadly round? Absolutely. And the reason they're as deadly as they are is because it's a very high velocity round. So they have a tendency to tumble and fragment when they hit a target like flesh. And yeah, I would not be volunteering to be shot with this because they do kill people. They are very deadly. Um, but let's talk about a deer rifle for a second. That bullet is probably good out to about, I've heard estimates depending on the barrel in question and how good what kind of twist it has, anywhere from like 500 yards to maybe 800 to 1,000 if you're lucky. And I'm probably going to get corrected by somebody on this one, and that's fine. In terms of accuracy and really preserving its power, that's probably about right. Um, 30-06 deer rifle. Now, first of all, 30-06 was originally developed as a military cartridge. That was the Springfield, the '06 Springfield was chambered in that caliber, and the M1 Garand was chambered in that caliber. And if you're not familiar with those firearms, they're both World War II firearms. Um, the Garand was a standard issue rifle. The Springfield became a sniper rifle. Um, 30-06 is probably good out to about 1,200 yards, maybe more, depending on the gun. 30-06 is a full-size rifle cartridge. It's a big bullet. It's a 30 caliber bullet. It's much bigger. And don't take my word for this. I mean, go to the sporting goods store and have them pull these things out for you and show it to you. You don't have to take my word for it. And like I said, I'd invite anyone who wants to dispute me. Go ahead and shoot both guns. 30-06 is way more powerful. That'll shoot through steel. Without an armor-piercing bullet. It's a much bigger, more powerful, heavier round, penetrates deeper. It will do far more damage on impact than a 5.56 NATO round. The reason the 5.56 NATO round is the standard issue in the military, a good chunk of it is because they are powerful enough to get the job done in enough circumstances, and they're light enough that you can carry a lot of them. But there are other cartridges that are far more powerful. So no, it is not a uniquely deadly weapon. It's a firearm, and as a firearm, it can kill people. And like any other weapon, if it's misused in the wrong hands, it's deadly. But to pretend that it is some kind of a super killing machine, it's like, I mean, it's like complaining about like a 3,000-pound bunker buster as being like the most deadly bomb in our arsenal. When pound for pound, there are other weapons we own. Not even going with nuclear weapons. There are other conventional munitions that are more potent in pound for pound in terms of explosive capacity. Not that the bunker buster doesn't do its job and do it well, but there are other munitions that are more powerful. Um, so I mean that's what I mean when I talk about disingenuous. And I think I'm going to wrap up with the whole orange man bad thing. That and I'm going to credit again. That was a term that I've heard Tim Pool use a lot. I'm going to give him credit as having coined it. Maybe he hasn't, but it refers to this just pathological rage and hatred of Trump. I'm going to be, in the interest of full disclosure, I'll say I am not one of his fans. I did vote for him in the last election. I'll probably end up voting for him again, but it wasn't because I wanted to. Honestly, I got stuck voting for Trump because I wasn't going to support Hillary. And of the two of them, have you ever seen that episode um, of South Park where they had the mascot elections at the school, and it was a giant douche versus a turd sandwich? From my perspective, Trump is the giant douche, but I'd rather have him than take a bite out of a turd sandwich. Um, I mean, I don't like Trump. I think Trump is a jerk. I will say that I think there's some things he's done right. I was impressed that he was able to get a dialogue going with Kim Jong Il or Kim Jong Un, excuse me. Um, if it goes somewhere, good for him. That would be an accomplishment, And I respect the hell out of the fact that he called off the air raid on Iran over that drone. That was a good sign of proper judgment and leadership. But then he goes off and says dumb things on Twitter. I don't like the guy. But here's the thing: the Democrats called W a racist for 8 years, and they played the same exact game with him. It wasn't as virulent, but they hated him too. For 4 years, he wasn't a legitimate president. Gore really won. And they're all pissed off about the Electoral College, and that's maybe another thing I should bring up about the Democrats. Um, but that's more of a policy issue, and I think it's probably something that ought to be discussed in a future video. Um, I I don't see why it is that they can't accept losing. The Democrats are unique for this. Republicans lost. John McCain lost to Obama. We had 4 years of Obama. By the end of 4 years, everybody on the right was ready to be done with Obama. And Obama was a jerk too. Everybody likes to act like he was this saintly man. This is the guy who basically told Republicans to sit down and shut up because he's in charge. And it was because he didn't like that they weren't just falling in line with his policy proposals. Well, no president's entitled to that. Of course, the opposing party is going to oppose you, particularly if you want to become, if you want to push hard to to the left or right. The opposing party is, of course, going to obstruct and oppose you. And I don't have a problem with the Democrat. My complaint is not with the Democrats opposing Trump on policy grounds. I would expect that from them. I may disagree with them, but that's something I expect from the opposition party. That's reasonable. Where it gets insane is where every little thing that he says is racist, and every time he's a sexist and a homophobe, and this is just made as if it's a statement of fact with little to no supporting evidence, or they'll take something that he said out of context, or whatever. And that's one problem. And then the other problem is we spent almost 4 years on this Russia investigation for it to come to nothing. And they still don't want to let it go. And here we are, we're going to waste money on impeachment proceedings in the House, knowing it's going to go to the Senate and die. There probably won't ever be a hearing in the Senate because I don't think they're going to have enough. As long as the Republicans run the Senate, it probably won't even come to a hearing. I think McConnell, if he's still in charge after the next round of elections, would be smart to give the hearing, just so it doesn't look like he's covering for Trump. But let's be honest, you need 60 votes to convict and remove a president. They're never going to get that done. I think there are Democrats that will probably vote against it because of the kind of political damage it's going to cost them. And here's the bottom line. This stinks of sour grapes and rage that they lost. And that's uniquely Democrats. Republicans lost twice to Obama, and you didn't see Republicans trying to impeach Obama. You didn't see You didn't see that same level of just unhinged hatred of all things Obama. Yeah, they didn't like him, and yeah, there was definitely some nasty stuff. And then you had the birther movement, which was crap. Um, wasn't on the same level. You didn't have Republicans attacking people who wore an Obama T-shirt, violently attacking them in the streets. You didn't have Republicans going around saying, "Defriend me if you voted for Obama," or any of that. You know, I'm not gonna. I mean, and they weren't trying to say he didn't. Well, actually, let me walk that back a step. You had the birther movement trying to say he wasn't legitimately the president because he wasn't an American citizen, and that did exist for a while. It wasn't on the same level. You didn't have like move after move after move of back alley attempts to unseat Obama like you see with Trump. I mean, and it was the same thing with W. It wasn't as severe, but there was the same thing. They just cannot stand to lose. The Democrats, they can't stand to lose. If they don't win the election, then they resort to other tactics, and they'll gin up their base by convincing them that it wasn't. They'll repetitively tell them it wasn't legitimate, not my president, etc. Um, wishing for things like, well, now they're hoping for a recession so they can stick it to Trump. So you hate him so much you want to stick it to the public just to stick it to Trump, because understand, if you get your wish, it may very well unseat Trump, and it's going to also have a lot of ordinary Americans who are going to get hurt. They're going to lose their jobs. They're going to find themselves having a lowered standard of living because of higher cost of living. Um, why would you wish that on the public? Why would I mean? Why? I don't know. That's why would you oppose things like this whole border wall nonsense? It's got to be such a stupid pissing contest between the two sides. I sort of agree with the Democrats that it's probably not going to have the impact that Trump and his followers think it is. It'll make it harder to get in here, but if you don't remove the incentives that make people want to sneak in to begin with, I don't think it's going to make a difference. It's not going to make a huge difference. It'll just make it harder. They'll come in another way. But that being said, for God's sakes, something's got to be done. In this idiocy of defund ICE, what? How do you expect? You can't, on the one hand, say we want socialized medicine, and we want open borders, and we want to give free health care to illegals, and expect that that's somehow going to work. Um, and I said I wasn't going to get into policy arguments, but I mean, just that's absurd. And again, it's a topic for another video, I think. Um, I mean, some of this is just oppose Trump to oppose. They're pissed off that Trump. Um, they're mad at Trump when he was aggressive with Kim. Then when he decided to sit down with Kim, they were mad at him for negotiating with a madman. Then when he walked away from the negotiating table when Kim doesn't want to negotiate in good faith, and he failed. And then when he walks into, when he manages to have a good conversation with Kim and is invited to walk into North Korea at great personal hazard, then they accuse him of manipulating the situation for a photo op. I mean, they just pathologically hate the guy for no reason, because he beat them, and because he doesn't, he'll stick it to them back, because he has a nasty attitude, and he does. He's not a nice guy. Trump's a jerk. But if you guys want a reason to be voted into office, you ought to learn from the Republicans' mistake with Obama, because this is the mistake that was made. A lot of why people fell in behind Romney wasn't because they supported Romney. Romney was kind of too moderate for a lot of the Republican Party. But everybody hated on the Republican side. They didn't like Obama, and they wanted him gone. So Romney's our boy. Guess what? The Republican base didn't turn out very well because I hate Obama is not a motivator to go vote. I hate Trump ain't a motivator to go vote Democrat. If you guys don't have something substantive to offer other than, just rage and we hate whitey and you're privileged and you're a douche and, the kind of things that they're saying, and then the few policy initiatives they offer are so far out there that it's just no one outside of the Democrat activist left is ever going to support that, then don't be surprised when you lose. And don't expect someone to reasonably consider you if your major party platform is we hate Trump. I mean, sure, yeah, you want to go forward with impeachment proceedings, go for it, because you're going to hand the election to Trump. You are. I mean, and I have more disagreements than agreements with the Democrat Party, but I mean, I will say, objectively speaking, you guys are on the verge of handing it to Trump because of how stupid you are. And now come out and say it, you're being stupid. You want to beat him? Beat him on the policy issues. You're not going to beat him by by running on Orange Man bad. But sure, go ahead, do it. You're also not going to beat him if you tell the white population of this country that we're all a bunch of racist jerks. And if you tell people that voted for him last time that you're racist for supporting him, that's not persuasive. That's going to make people want to double down. Because at some point people get to the point of, you know what, I'm tired of being called racist. I'm tired of being told I'm a bad person. For not agreeing to absolutely every last thing on the left-wing socialist wish list. I'm tired of being called racist because I don't want open borders, and I'm concerned about crime coming in from Mexico. I'm tired of being called intolerant because I don't want, or bigot because I don't want my elementary age child to learn about transgender ideology and homosexuality. That kind of thing, that attitude of there's no legitimate dissent, I think, is really a problem with the Democrats. And I guess I should have said that to start with. The Republican right, for the most part, will debate with you, and they'll debate with you fairly. There's some on the right that don't. I think Ann Coulter is a shining example of this. But then you get people like Shapiro. Shapiro is kind of a jerk, but Shapiro will debate you on merits, and he'll use logic, and he'll talk to you fairly. And when I mean I don't necessarily mean you have to be like you don't have to kiss butt and be real super polite. Fair debate is, let's argue logic, and we'll agree not to resort to the ad hominem, not to resort to the emotional appeal, and not to attack somebody's motives in holding an opinion. Let's debate it on the merits. That's fair logic. That's kind of how, when you go to court and argue a case, ideally that's how it should be argued, although practically speaking it isn't always how it is argued. Is you're going to debate it on the merits. In other words, these are the facts, these are the alternative positions, and how the facts might support this position or that position, and then you fist fight it out based on logic. You don't resort to attacking the advocate. You don't resort to name calling. You don't resort to carrying on, yelling, screaming, going off on irrelevant screeds, or trying to shout the person down, or trying to force them into silence. You beat them on the merits, or you lose on the merits. Problem with a lot of the Democrat left these days is there's just no legitimate dissent. If you oppose their viewpoint, AOC is a perfect example of this too. Sitting there saying, "Well, I'm in charge, and if you don't have a better idea, then shut up and let me do what I want." No, and no, just because someone disagrees with you doesn't mean they're a sexist or a racist. The fact that they might be white doesn't mean that they're opposed to you because you're not. The fact that somebody doesn't want unlimited illegal immigration in this country doesn't automatically mean it's based on race. Um, and it bears mention there's plenty of illegal immigration that comes out of Eastern Europe and Russia, and they're white as Wonder Bread. So I think it's disingenuous too to say it's a race issue. It is not. There are legitimate reasons not to be okay with that. There are also reasons that are not legitimate, but there are legitimate reasons. But from the Democrats' stamp, they don't believe there is a legitimate dissent, and they don't want to debate things fairly. And I think that's where I'm going to wrap this up. This has gone on. This is a long, long one. I think I've been on here for 2 hours, so I'm going to wrap this up. If you're still listening at this point, then I take my hat off to you, because I mean, this has gotten way longer than I planned on. Um, but anyways, I think my next one I'm going to talk about. There was a recent um, vote by the American Bar Association on the issue of affirmative consent to sex. And it seems like that's a good topic to talk about because it dovetails nicely into some things I talked about in this recording. Um, so until then, this is a Gray Knight signing off. Have a good night, and thanks for listening. If you like my videos, subscribe, like them, share them. I doubt very, very much that YouTube is going to promote this. So, anyways, have a good night.